It is past midnight outside the walls of a Judean town in the summer of 67 Common Era. A Jewish commander named Josephus stands on a parapet looking out at the Roman camp below. He can see the torches. He can hear the creaking. The Romans are winding something down in the dark. Bundles of rope thick as a man's thigh, twisted past the point any rope should be twisted, groaning under the strain. Somewhere out there, in the black field between the firelight and the wall, a machine is being loaded. The man standing closest to Josephus does not know it yet, but he has perhaps 30 seconds left to live. He cannot see the stone. He cannot see the arm. He hears only what sounds like a heavy door slamming shut a few hundred meters away, a single dry, percussive crack in the night. Then a sound in the air above him that he has never heard before and will never have time to identify. A rushing, a rip, and then his head is gone and his skull is sailing over the wall behind him, traveling at something close to the speed of a modern highway car, and it will not come to rest until it has crossed nearly 600 meters of ground. In the time it takes you to boil a kettle for a cup of tea, the Roman engine that fired that stone could be wound again, loaded again, and ready to throw a stone the weight of a grown man's torso across a distance equal to 4 American football fields laid end to end. This is not a trebuchet. This is not a medieval mangonel. This is something older, smaller, faster, and according to the men who saw it, more terrifying than anything that would come after it for 1,000 years. But here is the question that has divided historians for 2 centuries. Did the onager really do what the ancient witnesses said it did? Josephus claims he watched a single stone tear a man's skull from his shoulders and throw it 3 furlongs across open ground. He claims another stone struck a pregnant woman at her doorway and hurled her unborn child 100 meters down the street. These are not careful military reports. These are the words of a man trying to make readers in Rome understand something he believed they had never seen. And there is a second mystery, larger than the first. If this machine truly was Rome's deadliest artillery weapon, capable of crushing walls and crushing men, then why, when modern engineers built one in 2002, did it fail catastrophically on its second shot? And why, when Rome fell, did the onager not survive into the medieval world the way swords and shields and helmets did? Why does the deadliest single-armed engine in ancient warfare almost vanish from the record? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what the onager was, exactly how powerful it was, and exactly why the standard image of it in your head is probably wrong. If you are fascinated by the engineering, the violence, and the forgotten secrets of Rome's war machine, hit that like button and subscribe right now for more deep-dive military history. It costs you nothing and helps this channel grow. Now, let me take you back to the moment Rome first laid hands on this weapon. Josephus did not invent what he was seeing on that wall. The machine that killed the man beside him had a pedigree stretching back almost 400 years before he was born, into the workshops of Greek engineers who had figured out, sometime in the 4th century before Christ, that you could store enormous amounts of energy by twisting bundles of animal sinew, horsehair, or rope tighter and tighter until they were ready to explode. That was the secret. Not counterweights, not tension bows, torsion. A skein of fibers wound until it screamed, then released. The Greeks built 2 armed versions first, ballistae that fired bolts and small stones with surgical accuracy. Rome inherited the Greek technology Rome industrialized during the Republic, and by the 1st century BC Christ, every legion traveled with its own artillery park. The Romans did not invent the catapult. They industrialized it. Which brings us back to the man on the wall. Yosef ben Matityahu, the future Flavius Josephus, was 29 years old in the summer of 67. He came from a priestly family in Jerusalem. He had been educated in Jewish law and in Greek philosophy. He had once traveled to Rome as a diplomat and dined inside the court of Emperor Nero. And then, when the Great Revolt broke out, he had gone north to Galilee to command rebel forces against the very empire he had just been a guest of. That is the man writing the description, a rebel commander who within a year would be captured by the Roman general Vespasian, switch sides, take the Flavian family name, and spend the rest of his life writing in Rome as a client of the emperors he had once tried to kill. The most graphic surviving account of Roman artillery in action was written by a man who had stood on both sides of the war. The general besieging him, Vespasian, was a career officer in his late 50s. He was practical. He was patient. He was the kind of commander who believed that walls were broken by mathematics, not by miracles. And mathematics in his army meant engines. But the men on Josephus's war were not soldiers in any modern sense. Many were farmers from the Galilean hills. Many were masons and carpenters and fishermen who had picked up a spear 3 months ago and had never seen siege artillery in their lives. They had been told that God would defend the walls. They believed it. They had to believe it. And then the Romans dragged the engines forward, and the first stone came over the parapet, and the first man simply ceased to exist in the space where he had been standing. And after that, the question was no longer whether God would defend the walls. The question was, how many of them would still be standing at dawn? So what, exactly, was the onager? Imagine a wooden box the size of a wagon, built of beams as thick as a man's leg, lashed and bolted together with iron. Inside that box, running horizontally across its width, sits a single bundle of twisted rope, not rope as you know it, but a skein of sinew or hair or hemp, wound through the frame dozens of times and tightened by levers until the fibers vibrate at the touch. Through the center of that skein passes a single long wooden arm. When you wind that arm down against the torsion of the skein, you are bending physics. When you release it, the arm whips up and forward at terrifying speed and slams against a padded crossbeam. And the whole machine, 2 tons, 3 tons, 6 tons of timber and iron, kicks. It kicks so violently that the rear of the frame jumps off the ground. The Romans had a name for that kick. They called the engine onager, after the wild ass of the desert, because when it fired, it kicked exactly like one. At the end of the arm, depending on which century you are in and which engineer built it, there is either a leather sling or a wooden bowl. The sling is the more sophisticated solution. It adds an extra arc of acceleration to the stone, the way a sling adds reach to a man's arm. The bowl is what most people imagine when they hear the word catapult. We will come back to that distinction. It matters more than you think. A full-scale Roman onager weighed somewhere between 2 and 6 tons. To move it required oxen, specialized wagons, and a road. To assemble it on site required carpenters. To operate it required a trained crew. And to ammunition it required stones, round, dressed, sized to the bore of the sling, which had to be quarried, shaped, and stockpiled in their hundreds before a siege could even begin. 8 to 12 men served each engine. A capstan crew to wind the arm, a loader, an aimer, a commander who knew the engine's quirks better than he knew the faces of his own children. These were not common legionaries. These were specialists, the artillery technicians of the ancient world, and they were as valuable to a Roman general as engineers are to a modern army. We know what these men did because 2 late Roman writers tell us. The first is Ammianus Marcellinus, a Greek-speaking officer from Antioch, born around the year 330, who served in the elite guard under the emperors Constantius and Julian. He fought against Persians. He survived sieges. And he writes about the onager, not as a scholar, but as a man who has felt the ground shake when one fired. Ammianus tells his readers, with something close to admiration, that the onager is called by that name because when it is loosed, it kicks back like a wild ass. He says the stone it throws crushes whatever it hits, battlements, men, anything. He describes the engine as something to be respected and feared by the crews who operated it, not just by those who stood in front of it. The second writer is Vegetius, a name that has survived for 16 centuries, despite the fact that we know almost nothing about the man behind it. He was probably an imperial bureaucrat. He probably never commanded a legion. He probably never fired an artillery piece in his life. And yet his treatise on Roman military reform became the single most influential book on warfare in medieval Europe. He prescribed that every cohort of the Roman army should have its own artillery, scorpions and onagers integrated into the basic structure of the legion. There is a decision moment that haunts every Roman artillery officer at every siege, and it goes like this. The commander wants the wall down by tomorrow. Tomorrow there will be an assault, and the assault will only succeed if the parapets above the breach are smashed and the defenders are too rattled to organize a defense. The engineer in charge of the onagers knows what his commander does not. He knows that to deliver the kind of bombardment his commander wants, he must wind the torsion bundles tighter than the manuals allow. He must push the skeins past the safe number of turns. Tighter skeins mean further range. Tighter skeins mean a stone arriving with enough kinetic energy to take a head off a body across 600 meters of ground. Tighter skeins mean the wall comes down. But tighter skeins also mean the arm may snap on the first shot, the frame may split. A bursting torsion bundle does not fail quietly. When a rope skein under that much tension lets go, it whips like a steel cable. Men nearby have been blinded, dismembered, killed. Whether any particular Roman engineer made this choice in any particular siege, we cannot say. The names of these men are not preserved. But the choice itself is preserved, embedded in the very anecdotes Josephus gives us. A stone that throws a skull 3 furlongs is not a stone fired from a moderately tuned engine. That is a stone fired from a machine wound past the point of safety, by a crew who knew what they were doing, and knew what could go wrong, and decided that the wall mattered more than the engine, and more than themselves. The 2002 reconstruction we will come to later disintegrated on its second shot. That is what the limits of timber and tension look like in the real world. Every spectacular Josephus anecdote you have ever read about Roman artillery was probably purchased at exactly that cost. The decision was not made once. It was made before every assault. And the men on the wall, Josephus's men, the farmers from Galilee, the masons from Jerusalem, knew none of it. They only knew that the engines had been moved forward in the night. And in the morning, the first stones came. The Roman bombardment of a town did not begin with an explosion. It began with silence and waiting. And then a sound the defenders had no reference for, because nothing in their lives had prepared them for it. A heavy crack a few hundred meters out in the dark. A rushing in the air above them. And then an impact somewhere along the wall they were standing on, that they could feel in their feet before they understood it in their heads. The first stone in any siege is almost always a ranging shot. The crews need to know how their engines are behaving on this particular ground, in this particular weather, against this particular target. So the first stone usually flies long, or short, or wide. It lands in an empty stretch of wall or in the open ground inside the town, and it lands with a noise that travels through stone and bone alike. Behind the engine, the Roman crew is already winching the arm down again. 2 men on each capstan, a foreman counting turns. The skein groans. The arm bends. A loader hefts the next stone, 60 pounds, 80 pounds, sometimes more, into the sling, and a man on the side adjusts the angle of the entire frame by hammering wedges under the corners. They do this in perhaps 3 minutes. Then they do it again. But here is what should stop you cold. The crews firing these engines often could not see what they were hitting. They were behind earthworks. They were behind screens. They aimed by signals from a forward observer or by memorizing the bearing on the previous shot. Every stone that left a Roman onager left it blind. The man on the wall who had his skull torn from his body had been killed by men who never saw him. Inside the town, on the wall itself, the defenders were learning a new kind of fear. Arrows you could see, arrows you could dodge, arrows you could block with a shield. A stone from an onager you could not block. You could not even see it until it was already on top of you. The first instinct of any man under that kind of fire is to crouch. The second instinct is to run. And the moment defenders began to run, the wall stopped being a wall. It is here, in the middle of one such bombardment, that Josephus writes the passage that has fascinated and disturbed scholars ever since. He was on the wall. He was speaking with the men around him. He was, in his own account, close enough to one of them to touch him. And then a stone arrived. Years later, writing in Rome under the patronage of the very emperors who had ordered the bombardment, he chose these exact words to describe what he saw. And anyone may learn the force of the engines by what happened this very night. For as one of those that stood round about Josephus was near the wall, his head was carried away by such a stone, and his skull was flung as far as 3 furlongs, 600 meters. The skull of a man Josephus had just been standing beside was now lying in a field beyond the Roman lines. The body did not fall in one place. Josephus does not tell us what happened to the body, only what happened to the skull. We are left to imagine the rest. A torso, headless, still standing for a fraction of a second before it understands what has happened to it. The men on either side of it, blood-spattered and stunned. The terrible quiet that follows a single impossible event before everyone on the wall starts screaming at once. And here is the part historians cannot agree on. Was Josephus exaggerating? 3 furlongs is roughly 600 meters, that distance from the wall, over open ground, travelling with enough residual energy to be flung that far after already decapitating a man. Those are numbers that strain the physics of any wooden torsion engine we have ever managed to build. Either Josephus is telling us the literal truth, and Roman engineers were pushing their machines to levels we cannot now replicate, or he is telling us a story carefully calibrated to terrify his Roman readers into respecting the army he had switched sides to serve. Behind the Roman lines, the crews could not have known what their stone had done. They would have heard, later, from soldiers who heard it from prisoners. By the time the story reached them, it would already have started to grow. Roman artillerymen were proud of their work. They counted hits. They named their engines. The story of the skull that flew 3 furlongs would have been retold in 100 camps before it ever reached Josephus's manuscript. A Roman Onager battery firing at a sustained pace might produce a stone every 3 to 5 minutes per engine. If a besieging army deployed 6 engines against a single section of wall, and they often did, then a defender on that wall was facing one heavy stone arriving somewhere within 20 meters of him roughly every 30 seconds for hours. Hours. That is what a Roman bombardment was. Not a single spectacular shot. A grinding, relentless, hour-by-hour erosion of stone and nerve. Think about what that does to a human being. Not the dying, the waiting, the not knowing. Every 30 seconds, a stone you cannot see lands somewhere along the wall you are standing on. It might land on you, it might land on the man next to you, it might land in the street behind you and crush a roof you slept under last night. The Romans were not just trying to break walls, they were trying to break minds, and they were very, very good at it. But the worst of it had not started yet, because the Roman engineers had not yet wound their machines to the limits. They were saving that for the morning of the assault. And what they would do on that morning would produce the single most disturbing passage in the entire surviving literature of ancient warfare. Dawn comes to the besieged town in a haze of dust. The wall is not the wall it was yesterday. Whole sections of parapet have been chipped away. The crenellations along one stretch are simply gone, sheared off as cleanly as if a giant hand had run along the top and broken the teeth out. The masons inside the town have been trying to repair the damage during the night, working by torchlight, dragging rubble into the gaps. They have not slept. They will not sleep again. The Roman command has decided that today is the day. The engines that have been firing at moderate tension for the past week are now being wound to the limits the engineers will allow. The torsion skeins are being soaked, tightened, soaked again. The capstans are being inspected. The stones being loaded today are not the medium projectiles of the ranging fire. They are the heavy ones, 50, 80, in some cases the full 100 pounds that Josephus describes. 100 pounds, 45 kilograms, the weight of a small adult woman. Josephus tells his readers that he saw stones of that size hurled 400 yards, roughly 370 meters, by Roman engines firing at full power. If that figure is even approximately accurate, the kinetic energy delivered by such a stone on impact would be equivalent to a small modern car striking a wall at highway speed. Modern scholarship, working from experimental reconstructions and the surviving textual descriptions, places the optimum effective range of a full-scale onager at approximately 130 meters, about 430 feet. That is the range at which the engine can be aimed, can be reloaded, and can be expected to put a stone reliably where you want it. Beyond that range, you are still throwing the stone, but you are not really aiming it anymore. You are sending it in the general direction of the enemy, and hoping. And here is the cruel mathematics of the onager. Inside that 130-meter killing zone, the weapon was devastatingly effective. Outside of it, it was unreliable, expensive, and often outranged by simpler tools. The onager was not Rome's long-range artillery. The onager was Rome's close-in siege hammer. It was built to be brought up almost into bowshot of the wall, and to break that wall apart while the men inside watched, which meant the crews were inside bowshot too. Roman artillerymen working onagers in the close-range siege role died. They died of arrows from the parapets. They died of stones thrown from above. They died when their own engines failed catastrophically, when a skein burst and lashed back across the firing platform, or when the arm itself snapped and sent splinters of timber the length of a man through anyone unlucky enough to be standing behind it. Not every Roman stone hit the wall. Some sailed over it. They sailed into the town behind, into a maze of houses pressed shoulder to shoulder, into streets where civilians were still trying to live whatever scraps of life were left to them. A stone that misses the parapet by 10 feet of altitude does not stop. It keeps going. It comes down somewhere 100 meters inside the city, through a tile roof, through a wooden ceiling, through whatever and whoever is underneath. This is the part of the bombardment that Josephus describes with the most controlled horror. He had been a commander. He had ordered men to die. He had seen battle. But the next passage in his account is not about a soldier. It is about a woman who had nothing to do with the war, except for the accident of living in a town the Romans had decided to break. She had just stepped out of her house. We do not know her name. We do not know how old she was. We know only what Josephus tells us, and what Josephus tells us is this. In the daytime also, a woman with child had her belly so violently struck, as she was just come out of her house, that the infant was carried to the distance of half a furlong, so great was the force of that engine. Half a furlong, 100 meters. A child not yet born, torn from its mother's body by a stone, and carried by the momentum of that stone the length of a city block before it came to rest. Pause on that sentence. Read it again. Josephus is not writing this to shock his readers gratuitously. He is writing it to demonstrate with cold precision the energy contained in a single shot from a Roman onager. He uses the body of a pregnant woman as a measuring instrument. That is the kind of testimony we have. That is the only kind of testimony anyone has bothered to leave us about what these weapons actually did to human beings. In the streets behind the wall, this was the new arithmetic of the siege: a man drawing water at a well, a child running between buildings carrying bread, an old woman sweeping a doorway. Any one of them, at any moment, could become a statistic in a historian's catalogue of artillery performance. There was no safe place inside the town. There was no shelter that 100-pound stone could not punch through. The Romans had not just surrounded the town, they had introduced random death into every street of it. On the wall, a defender, call him what we cannot prove him to be, a young Galilean farmer turned rebel, the kind of man the records do not name, watches the man 6 feet to his right cease to exist between one breath and the next. He has not heard the impact, he has felt it. He looks down. His own forearm is wet with something that is not his. This is the moment commanders fear. This is the moment when a wall full of men decides all at once, without orders, without discussion, that whatever is up here is worse than whatever is down there. The defender is not a coward. He has been on that wall for 9 days. He has watched the Roman engines roll forward inch by inch. He has watched his friends die in ways he did not know human beings could die. And now he climbs down, and the man next to him climbs down, and in 5 minutes there are gaps along the parapet long enough to drive a wagon through. This is what artillery was for, not just smashing walls, smashing the men on top of them. A defender on the wall who decides his life is worth more than his post is doing exactly what Roman engineers spent 2 centuries refining their machines to make him do. The onager was not a structural weapon. It was a psychological weapon. The stones it broke were almost incidental to the men it broke first. Josephus, who watched this kind of disintegration from inside a doomed defense, would later command the men trying to hold the cliff fortress of Jotapata against Vespasian. He would watch his own walls broken. He would watch his own men break. He would survive the fall of the city by hiding in a cistern with 40 other men, and he would emerge from that cistern by walking out alone to surrender to the Romans, having outlived the others through means his enemies and admirers have argued about for 2,000 years. When a Roman bombardment ended, it did not end with celebration. It ended with silence. The crews stopped winching. The capstans stopped clicking. The torsion bundles, exhausted, sagged in their frames. The 6-ton wooden boxes that had been kicking like the wild ass that named them for 8 straight hours stood quiet on their platforms, hot to the touch, the iron fittings warm enough to burn skin. A Roman onager fired at full tension could not be fired at full tension indefinitely. Modern reconstructions suggest that maximum stress firing fatigues the timber and the skein within hours. The machines that broke the walls of Jewish cities, of Persian fortresses, of barbarian strongholds were not eternal. They were consumed in the process of doing what they did. By the time a town fell to a Roman assault, the engines that had broken it were often only good for firewood. The infantry assault did not begin until the engineer in charge of the artillery told the general that the parapets were unmanned and the breach was clear. When that word came, passed up the chain of command by signal flags and shouting officers, the legionaries began to move. Not in a great wave, not in the cinematic charge of a Hollywood movie, in a controlled, measured advance, behind shields in formations the Romans had been refining since before Carthage. When they reached the wall, they found what artillery had done to it, sections of dressed stone reduced to gravel. A parapet that looked like it had been chewed, the dust of pulverized masonry coating every surface for 50 meters around. Bodies along the base of the wall, some Roman, more defenders, some so disfigured by impact that the men carrying them out later could not be sure what they had been. Inside the town, the artillery damage was different. Houses with their upper floors gone, streets blocked by collapsed walls, a well destroyed by a stone that had come down through its winch house. The defenders who survived the bombardment came out into the streets to fight the Romans, and they fought in a city that no longer made sense, that had been remapped by random impacts, in which a man who had grown up on a particular street could no longer find his own front door. And here is the part of the story modern viewers always miss. The Roman onager did not win the assault. The Roman infantry won the assault. The onager simply ensured that the assault could happen at all. Every Roman victory at every wall in every late siege was a partnership between engines and men, and the engines did the part the engines could not do, and the men did the part the engines could not do. Subtract either, and the assault failed. By evening, the town was Roman, or what was left of the town was Roman. The wall had been cleared. The streets had been cleared. The survivors had been driven into the central square or the temple precinct, or whatever defensible building was left. The Roman engineers behind their earthworks were already disassembling the engines, marking the timber, salvaging what could be salvaged. Tomorrow the army would march. Whatever the onagers had been would be loaded onto wagons in pieces. A single Roman onager battery at a single major siege might fire several hundred to several thousand stones over the course of operations. The quarrying, dressing, and transport of those stones consumed days of labor for crews of men who were not soldiers and whose names are not preserved anywhere in the surviving record. The onager was not just a weapon. It was the apex of an enormous logistical apparatus. Quarries, wagons, oxen, carpenters, rope makers, engineers, all of it organized for the purpose of throwing one stone, then another, into the body of one enemy city. And then, somewhere between the late 4th century and the early 7th, this entire apparatus quietly vanished from the record. The engines stopped being built. The crews stopped being trained. The texts stopped being copied. By the time medieval Europe needed siege artillery again, the onager was a memory, recovered only through manuscripts that had survived by accident in monastery libraries. The disappearance of the Roman onager is one of the strangest stories in the history of military technology. We are talking about a weapon that by every surviving description was the most powerful single-armed throwing engine ever built in the ancient world. And then, sometime in the chaos of the 5th and 6th centuries, it simply stops appearing in the sources. No grand battle ends its story. No catastrophic failure discredits it. It just fades. Part of the answer is that the apparatus that produced it died before the weapon did. Roman onagers required Roman engineering. They required Roman supply chains. They required ironworkers who could produce specific fittings, rope makers who could produce skeins to specific stresses, carpenters who could season timber for specific stresses. When the Western Empire fragmented, the supply chain fragmented with it. A successor kingdom could inherit the manuals. It could not inherit the workshop network that made the manuals usable. So, back to Josephus, and back to the question we asked at the start. Did a Roman stone really decapitate a man and throw his skull 600 meters across open ground? The honest answer, after 2,000 years of debate and a century of modern experimentation, is probably yes, on rare occasions, with an engine wound to extreme tension. The kinetic energy required to throw a human skull 600 meters from a standing impact is enormous, but not impossible. The cost is that the engine which did it was not likely to survive many more shots like it. We know this because in 2002, a team of engineers built a full-scale Roman onager, using the best surviving textual and visual evidence, and they fired it. The machine weighed roughly 2 to 6 tons, depending on how you measure the support frame. It threw a 26-kilogram limestone ball, 57 pounds, just over half the weight of Josephus's largest stones, a distance of 82 meters. And then, on its second shot, the timber of the engine disintegrated. The frame split. The arm cracked. The reconstruction had lasted at full performance for 2 shots. 2 shots. That is what a modern, well-funded, carefully engineered reconstruction of a Roman onager managed at its full operational power before it tore itself apart. Now imagine doing that with 1,600-year-old materials in the field under enemy fire with a crew that has to keep firing whatever happens. Josephus's anecdotes are not impossible. They are simply the most expensive shots in the history of Roman engineering, and they were paid for in machines and in men. The casualty figures from artillery alone are almost impossible to recover from the ancient record. Ancient historians did not break down deaths by cause of injury. We know that in major Roman sieges, Jerusalem in 70, Jotapata in 67, Masada in 73, the total death tolls ran into the tens of thousands. We do not know how many of those deaths came from artillery fire. What we know is that artillery was the instrument by which defenders were driven from walls, after which infantry did the closer work. The onager did not produce the highest body count. It produced the conditions under which the highest body count became possible. And as for the second mystery, why this machine, more than any other Roman weapon, almost vanished from history, the answer is layered. It vanished because the empire that produced it vanished. It vanished because the engineering culture that maintained it could not be inherited by smaller kingdoms. It vanished because the medieval world found a simpler solution, the traction trebuchet, pulled by teams of men, requiring no torsion skeins, no specialized rope makers, no precision carpentry. The onager was a high-technology weapon. When the high technology of Rome collapsed, the weapon collapsed with it. Josephus himself lived to old age in Rome. He was given citizenship. He was given a pension. He spent his final decades writing, in Greek, the history of a war he had fought on the losing side and then on the winning side. His writings were the only reason anyone in the medieval and early modern world had any clear picture at all of what Roman siege artillery had done. The rebel-turned-historian who had stood on the wall watching his own men die became, by the long accident of literary survival, the most important witness we have to the weapon that killed them. Ammianus finished his history in Rome and died there. His Latin was difficult and his manuscripts barely survived. Vegetius's treatise was copied obsessively through the Middle Ages because medieval kings believed it would teach them how to fight like Romans. They built their own siege engines from his descriptions. Most of those engines did not work very well. The bureaucrat whose manuals built medieval engines had not been a field commander, and the manuals he wrote were the imperfect memories of an imperfect witness, transmitted across 1,000 years to readers who had never seen what they were trying to rebuild. The man Josephus saw decapitated has no name. The woman at her doorway has no name. The men of the artillery crews have no names. The Galilean farmers and Jerusalem masons who stood on the walls have no names. They are not in the inscriptions. They are not in the tomb markers. They exist only as data points in a Roman officer's description of how powerful a wooden machine could be. That is the price of being on the wrong end of an empire's engineering. But the battle's end was just the beginning of how the onager would be remembered and misremembered for the next 1,600 years. When most people today picture a Roman catapult, they picture an onager. They picture a wooden box, a great single arm, a bucket at the end of the arm, a knot of crewmen pulling on ropes. They picture it because that is the image Renaissance artists drew, working from manuscripts they barely understood, and that image was inherited by Victorian engravers. Who passed it on to 20th century film designers? Who passed it on to the video game studios that built the medieval and ancient worlds most modern viewers carry in their heads? Almost all of it is probably wrong, or at least almost all of it is more uncertain than the picture suggests. We have very little physical evidence of what a Roman onager actually looked like. We have stone projectiles in their hundreds. We have a few metal fittings. We have textual descriptions by men who, in some cases, may have been describing the engines from memory or from second-hand report. The rest is reconstruction. And here is the fact most people watching this video have never been told. The onager was probably not Rome's primary battlefield artillery. For most of the Roman period, Roman armies preferred the two-armed ballista, a much more accurate machine that fired bolts and small stones with something approaching precision. The onager appears clearly in the sources only in the late imperial period, as one specialized siege engine among several. The image of the onager as the iconic Roman catapult is largely a product of medieval and early modern artists, who knew the word onager from Vegetius and Ammianus and assumed it must have been the main weapon. It almost certainly was not. Even the shape of the weapon may be wrong in popular memory. Many modern scholars now argue that the standard onager probably used a leather sling at the end of its arm, not the rigid bowl or bucket that Renaissance and Victorian illustrations show. A sling adds another arc of acceleration, increasing range significantly. It also makes the weapon look subtly different from the squat, bucket-armed silhouette modern audiences imagine. The classic onager in our minds may never have existed in Rome at all. It may be a Renaissance guess that got mistaken for evidence. And the third thing most people get wrong, the assumption that the medieval mangonel was just an onager with a different name. For a long time, that is what historians believed, that Roman torsion artillery quietly evolved into medieval torsion artillery. The current consensus is that this is largely a myth. Most medieval mangonels appear to have been traction trebuchets, powered by teams of men hauling on ropes, not by twisted skeins. The line from Roman Onager to medieval siege engine is not a clean evolution. It is, by most modern accounts, a break and a rediscovery, which brings us back to the wall in 67 Common Era, and to Josephus, and to the man standing beside him whose skull travelled 3 furlongs across open ground in the dark. We do not know that man's name. We do not know what he was doing on the wall. We do not even know for certain that the engine which killed him was the weapon later writers would label an onager. It might have been something rougher, something experimental, something the late Romans had not yet given a name. What we know is that he was the first careful measurement in the surviving literature of the West of what a torsion engine could do to a human being. He was, in the cold language of Roman engineering, the proof. That is what Rome's deadliest artillery machine actually was, not the wooden monster of our imagination. Something stranger, something rarer, something more expensive to fire than anyone today realizes, and the only reason we know any of it is that a rebel commander captured and turned lived long enough to write the story of the men he had failed to save. If you made it this far, you already know what this channel is about. Subscribe.